You know, and as we talk about this the late 19th century and talking about, okay, where did you, you know, as far as employment opportunities, where would you find African Americans? I don't want to make it sound glowing, like it was a glowing experience, because even though they're dominating the service sector, you know, and it's not only me who said this, you know, I've benefited not only from your work, but also from Richard Starnes' work. And jobs did not pay a lot of money. So as far as, and they were seasonal. So off season, you know, people struggled. And so even though there were employment opportunities for African Americans, poverty was still a huge problem for people of color in the region. I mean, I think that was across the board for everybody, but it was doubly the case for African Americans in many ways.
And you know, to point out too that at the same time that you have sort of the service industry developing in connection to tourism, you know, in the early end of this period, you have the issue of convict labor and the construction of railroads.
Absolutely.
And Swannanoa Tunnel and all the sort of hardship and loss of life that was associated with the construction of the Western North Carolina Railroad to Asheville. And then, you know, I feel like sort of I hear David Wisnant reminding me in the back of my mind too, right? That, you know, early 20th century Asheville was a lot of, you know, mills and textiles and other sorts of enterprises too. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think African Americans were typically involved or welcome into the mill labor force.
No, not at all. And and then even, you know, after the railroad made it into places like Asheville and then going further into Western North Carolina, there weren't many opportunities for African Americans there, other than doing kind of the back-breaking labor that went into that industry as well. Key, you know, to helping to open the region up, especially Asheville benefited greatly from the fact that the railroad made it here 1880, I think. It was 1880, yes, right.
Believe so, yeah.
Took a long time, but, you know, as you said, African American labor played a major role in that. A major role in the construction industry in Asheville and Western North Carolina in general, because if you take the Grove Park Inn, I mean, even though that's 1913 when it opens, African American labor was key to actually completing that project.
So I feel like we've kind of touched on this, but I feel like we need to attack it sort of directly, which is, how did this community building, institution building, did it not? Was it an uneven story? How does it translate then into sort of political power or political sort of engagement in terms of Asheville for the Black community?
Well, Steve, it really doesn't. You know, I think one of the last chapter of my dissertation, which, you know, when you read that chapter, you can see where, and especially the early part of it, I'm relying heavily upon the work that you did on Reconstruction, looking at what was going on politically during this period. As the late 19th century wears on, African Americans become an increasingly insignificant part of the political makeup of Asheville and Western North Carolina. There's one point, I think, Steve, that I can point to say where they had a significant role in the politics of Asheville, and that was in 1888 in relation to the vote to create the public school system, to fund the public school system for the city. And as you know, in the late 19th century, well, post-Civil War, post-emancipation period, education was one of the most important pieces to community building for African Americans. I mean, they were going to, you know, who is it? I think it's Eric Foner who has said that they were willing to tax themselves in order to support a school system. And they essentially did this as well. But there was a real push to develop the school system for Asheville. There was resistance to that, and it had a lot to do with the taxes and the politics of this. You know, whites did not want us to pay taxes to support a system that was going to educate African Americans. at one point, there's a debate that takes place in the state legislature where they get into this back and forth about white dollars going to support a white school system and black dollars going to support a black school system. We already know that African Americans own very little. You're not going to get a lot of financial support to the system if you divide the tax dollars that way. And I think one African American legislator actually came up with a proposal, and I think I write about this in the chapter, where he says, well, let's do this. We can divide the money up. Yeah, white dollars can go to support white schools, black dollars go to support schools, but all of the white fathers who have children, who have mulatto children, their money will be divided up so that it supports a black school system. So I tell that story just to give a sense of how divisive this whole issue of public education, especially for African Americans, was in this post. But when Asheville's leaders were really trying to make sure that they would be successful in a vote to support the development of schools, they had to have Americans on board. I think I can remember the figures from the vote, that it was 718 against the building of a school, the development of the school system in Asheville, and 722 the creation of it in 1888. And so that was one time when votes were needed to actually push through this program of education for the city of Asheville. But beyond that, in fact, I think one of the trade-offs to ensure that African American support to support the school system was that they decided to put Isaac Dixon on the school board. And so when I started looking at the records, it was interesting to discover that while he was appointed to the school board, the city school board, in that first year after the school system was created, he was not renewed the next year. All of the people who had gone on with him were renewed. And I think that was a part of the trade-off, that if he was able to deliver the African-American vote, then they would give him a seat, but that seat only lasted for that 1 year. So that's the only time that you can see where African-Americans were very, at least it seems. There's another story, Steve, I think I should point out here, that many people, when they're talking about the history of African Americans in Asheville, they point to, I think, 1968 as being the year that the first African American was elected to the city council, and that was Reuben Daly. He was an attorney in Asheville. But actually, there was an African American who served on the board of aldermen for Asheville in the 1880s, and his name was Newton Shepherd. I don't have my dissertation in front of me in my notes, so I can't remember the exact year.
Right.
But I've never been able to really figure out how that happened. I do believe that at the time, Asheville was divided up into wards. So you had a dominant number of African Americans that in one ward, and that may have been how he got elected to the board of aldermen that year. But he served, I think, a 2-year term, and he's one of those names that's kind of been forgotten. He's very, in the historic Riverside Cemetery in an unmarked grave. But he's one of those figures I think many people in Asheville have kind of forgotten about, and they didn't know about the contribution that he kind of made in that role in that early period.
Right. It's just on a sort of researcher to researcher sort of level, right? That's one of those things that will haunt you, right, for forever. Is like, you want to find the story. And one of the things that, again, sort of gives me hope about historical scholarship now is so much stuff is continuously coming out and getting digitized. And I find myself, the book is done, my book is done, but like I still find myself periodically researching it. It's like I keep waiting for something else to come up, and looking for pictures or details about individuals, and there's always these sort of tantalizing sort of figures that kind of come up. Shepherd sounds like one of those figures. for me, it was Edward Horsey, who was evidently involved with the what was called the Colored Union League in Buncombe County in Asheville during Reconstruction. He pops up on a couple different instances, but that's it. Like, that's as much as I can find. You know, one of the things I always hope comes out of doing this web series is that maybe somebody will watch it and they'll be like, "Oh, hey, I know that person, or I know that name, or that was my great grandfather, or whatever." And that's actually happened to me once. Like, I wrote something, and somebody contacted me and said, "Well, you know, that was my great grandfather." And I was like, "Oh, well, we need to talk."
See, you know, and that that with the people that I have worked on in the dissertation, the only person who has a descendant that I know is James Vester Miller, and that was Andrea Clark, who lives in Asheville now. She grew up in Boston. If you talk to Andrea, you know, you hear that Boston accent.
Yeah.
She was a photographer, but I've not had any of those stories that you just described happen to me, other than talking about, well, I think one interesting story that I will get in here, if we have time, is with my own history.
Right.
And so my great grandfather was Lewis Waters, and he was born in 1860. I mean, this is just the year before the Civil War really starts.
Right.
You know? So my great grandparents, his parents, they show up as living in Western North Carolina in Henderson County in 1850. So they're in the 1850 census. Now, they were originally from South Carolina. They're free people in 1850. I don't know what their status had been in South Carolina. I haven't researched it back that far. But they have, you know, their last child, my great grandfather, Lewis, in 1860. By the time my grandfather, his son, was born in 1897. And my grandfather decided he didn't get married until late. He was 42 years old when he married my grandmother. So by the time my father was born, my father is the oldest of the 10 children that they had. By the time he was born in 1942, his grandfather, my great grandfather, was no longer living. So he said he never knew him, didn't know much about him. And I was too young really to ask my grandparents much about him, especially my grandfather. I don't recall ever asking my grandfather anything about his. But given the time period that he was born in, I would, and given the fact that we're talking about Western North Carolina, you see the battle that goes on to build a school system in Asheville, 1980. I had serious doubts about whether or not he was an educated person or not. So, but there was no way to prove or disprove that.
Right.
Just no information. Very few records that you can find related to the African American experience. A lot of it, is from oral tradition in many respects, which can often be wrong. I was able to do this dissertation, this project, because Biltmore Estate allowed me access to their records. And they just had this plethora of records because of George Vanderbilt's relationship with the African American community, especially Shiloh, and then with the building of the YMI. Right. Well, my first day there, you've heard me tell this story before, but my first day at Biltmore Estate working in archives, we just decided to put in my grandfather's name, his birth year, to do a search to see what would come back. We get 3 hits. We go back into the stacks, and then I end up pulling out 3 handwritten letters from my great grandfather, because he was doing business with the estate when the estate was being built. So it confirmed that he was actually an educated person. He was educated. He was a businessman. We knew that he eventually owned an apple orchard in Henderson County. But I would love to be able to find or connect more stories like that if it were possible to do that.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the sad realities, and one of the reasons why historians often gravitate towards wars and periods of warfare is because a lot more people write
Right.
during the course of wars than they might otherwise. And in the case of somebody doing Reconstruction stuff, you have the Freedmen's Bureau and other sorts of groups on the ground collecting material that otherwise people would not have had access to.
Right.
But I mean, what a great story to be able to sort of connect to Biltmore and find your own family directly into their archives.
Yeah. So
unbelievable. Yeah, no, I'm always sort of still trying to turn over those like local personal stories and trying to connect it.
You know, I find more of them obviously you find more records and you get more stories when you're talking about people from mid 20th century and late 20th century. So, you know, we've done a lot of work around my other grandfather, Isaiah Rice, and he was born 1917, World War II vet, but photography was his hobby. And so he just, you know, over the course of his lifetime, from the late 1940s all the way up until 1980 when he died, he's taken all of these photographs around Asheville in all of these different communities. But the photographs actually cut across the color line. So it kind of shows how he had this kind of respected relationship with both the African-American community and people within the white community as well. But, you know, with some of those photographs, people, and they go, oh, I remember who that was. That was my, you know, my mother. So I get a lot of stories like that in the late mid to late 20th century period. But it would be great to get stories like that from people dating back to the late 19th century. And no, I hope somebody somewhere is connecting those dots right now, and it'll come out. It might not be you and me, but hopefully somebody somewhere is doing it. And I'll be happy when they do. Maybe we should dig under the Vance Monument a little bit more. We might find some more stuff.
See what else is buried under there. I know. Yeah, I know what that monument obscures. But I don't know what else might be under it. So this is sort of winding towards my last question, and it seems now after this conversation, it seems like a somewhat odd sort of ending spot, because we've been talking so much about recovering the sort of people and talking about their stories and sort of giving sort of texture to their lives. And yet I feel like I have to come back to this idea and this sort of ongoing myth and idea about, and I know you sort of reference it in your dissertation. I think you even started a chapter with it. I know I've heard it in a couple of different contexts when I was doing research of, you know, African Americans in Western North Carolina are rarely seen and seldom heard. And that can be projected out to Southern Appalachia as a whole. It could be applied to Asheville. But the idea that there's still this ongoing myth that, you know, Black people and communities of color are obscured and blocked or not seen or not there, just not there. I mean, I did a round table once with somebody, and they said, you know, there were no Black people in Appalachia. People in Appalachia didn't know what slavery was. It's all wrong historically. But not just to talk about that myth, but maybe sort of how does that myth continue to sort of play a role in terms of African American, you know, political and economic and community building within Asheville and Buncombe County?
Well, you know, Steve, we could do a whole show on just this topic alone.
You have, right? Your radio show has done a lot on this.
Because this was the driving force really behind my research. It was the reason why I as a native of the region, I got very tired of people telling me that there were no African Americans in the region. And so I'm thinking, you know, look, I exist. So, you know, and I'm thinking, well, my family history goes back at least until the 1850s. And then there were all of the people I grew up with, family, friends, my grandmother, my dad's mother is from Rutherford County, in an area called Lake Louise. So there are African Americans, there are people of color in these mountains. I think a lot of that myth has, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Steve, but I still think that myth was really imposed on the region mainly by outsiders, people writing about it, especially in the late 19th century. We could talk about the whole angst around the issue of race as we get post Reconstruction period. The country is kind of tired of this whole issue of race, so we're looking for to get beyond it. But where is this region that needs uplift and can benefit from uplift? It was seen as the Southern Appalachian Mountains was seen as that space. So many of these philanthropists felt that they were investing their money into a space that was largely, if not all, white. I mean, so it's not only African Americans who get obscured by that, but you take the Native American history of the region, it gets obscured by that too, which is just, I think, it says a lot about American history. We like to create these myths about who we are. And this was one of those myths that was created. And then, I tell people a lot too that I had family in California. And when they think of the mountains, they think about those images that were created by outsiders of the hillbilly, the kind of deliverance image, because my in-laws would say to me all the time, whenever I would see them, and tell them that I was from Asheville, they would say, isn't that the place where they filmed Deliverance, in the mountains? And, you have to make this argument that, it is an urban space, as we talked about earlier, that it has running water, all of these things. But I think that outside image that was imposed upon the region as being kind of this undeveloped area of the country, in that post Civil War period, especially when industrialization is beginning to really rapidly take hold across the South and then across the country as well, has really played a key role in obscuring the history of African Americans here. And let's face it, you write about this in your work. It's not a large population.
No,
it's not a large population of people, but it is a population nonetheless. And it has a history. There's a culture that goes with it. I think that the rugged individualism that we talk about being a part of kind of the Southern Appalachian tradition among people here, I think that that's also a part of the tradition of African Americans in the region. I had a conversation with a friend who is from this region, now a political leader in the region, not too long ago, and he was talking about one of his friends coming from Chicago to visit he and his wife here in Asheville. And he said that his friend was very surprised that there were so many African Americans in the city, are in Asheville, or right out in those communities that we talked about earlier, Shiloh, Burton Street, and those areas, and how open people seem to be. They didn't, didn't have a lot of these kind of hang-ups that people have in other places. And my friend said that he told his friend that, look, we're mountain people. You don't bother us, we don't bother you. And so I think that that's really kind of a Southern Appalachian mountain kind of attitude that people kind of have. And so, and I think that's been written about a lot about white people in the region. And I think it's the case with African Americans here as well. But what I'm excited about, Steve, I think is really good, is because the work that people like yourself are doing, the work that John Insco has done, Gordon McKinney, the work that I'm doing through the research that I'm doing, we could name just a plethora of other people who are kind of laboring in this field to kind of tell these untold stories, that I think that it is helping to kind of solidify the identity of African Americans in the region. It's generating a lot of creativity in the arts. You've now got the Afro-Lacha Artist Project. We talk about, we haven't mentioned Bill Turner, Dr. William Turner.
Right.
His and his colleague Ed Cabell, who died, I think, a couple of years ago. But they're kind of the ones who really initiated this research through anthology they did in 1985 on Black in Appalachia. That's beginning to kind of tell the story, and I think that people are interested in what what that experience means, how it has shaped the region. What that means for us as a region going forward, how can it be better incorporated into the larger narrative about the region? I think that we're making great strides in actually doing that work.
Yeah, I agree, and I think one of the things that helps me sort of see that is the conference that you host every October, which has sort of grown, and for me, that's just always such a great time to come and just kind of listen and see. And because I mean, as an academic, you can kind of get, especially as a historian, I don't know sometimes if people recognize on the outside, like how isolating being a historian can be. Like you spend a lot of time alone reading, going through archives, things like that.
And with dead people,
with dead people, and in your own head, or where I spend hours and hours and hours on Google just trying to find pictures of people that I'm writing about, finding them in newspapers.com and things like that. But to see sort of the sort of work that's going on in sort of communities and whatnot, and the group organization Black in Appalachia, the stuff that they're doing, putting a lot of this sort of work online so that people can access it and they can see it. I mean, that's like, I have a similar sort of sense that when students, write, Southerner, and why it always kind of chafes me when they separate Southerner from African American in the 19th century. It's like, you don't understand how much of African American influence there is in Southern
in the region. That's right.
Exactly. That it's intertwined in a way that often gets separated out.
And see, we think about in people who forget. We talk about forgetting people and the contributions they made. I mean, it's with the conference that you have participated in. You've helped design it, to help build it to where it is too. That which has been an important contribution to that. You think about some of the stories that have come out of that. It's like a rediscovery of Nina Simone and her Appalachian roots. I mean, and when you listen to her music, you can really hear that kind of Southern Appalachian kind of sound in a lot of. When she talks, you can hear it when she talks, and you can hear it when she sings. And last year, one of the students in the student research that we've done did a brilliant paper on Moms Mabley. Loretta, I can't remember her last name off the top of my head, but Moms Mabley was really the forerunner to Black female comedians, and she may have been really a forerunner to female comedians in general. But being from Transylvania County, which is a story that we've forgotten. Shirley Henfield is another who, and people will remember her, I guess, from the 70s show What's Happening. And she was born and raised right here in Asheville in Western North Carolina, went to Stevens Lee High School. She and my mother were classmates in school. Wow. So these are all of these stories that have been lost, but are now kind of being uncovered. And you made the point about when people come together, when people do get a chance to come together and see that other people are doing the same, or at least working in the same field that you're working in, it kind of really, it produces this excitement. It's exciting to see what is actually happening within this field of study about African Americans in this region. So it's been fun to be a part of it. I would have never envisioned this when I started off on that PhD at Chapel Hill, but it has been fun and very rewarding.
Yeah. Well, in some ways, I'd say that your experience sort of belies the idea of the isolated academic, because you are very much on the opposite end of that, of doing a lot of outreach and institution building of your own and sort of creating these connections that I greatly appreciate and always enjoy coming in October to the conference. And, just hearing the work that's going on. We've talked a lot about John Insco and Gordon McKinney, but seeing where people are taking it, Bill Turner, seeing where people are taking it now, seeing the sort of work that people are doing now in the different fields, which is just really exciting.
It is. Well, I tell you, Steve, I know we probably ran out of our time here.
Yeah, we're stretching it. We're definitely running out of time, but this is one of those things that here in the sort of trials of 2020, that we're still very much in the midst of a pandemic, sort of have this opportunity, scholar to scholar, to talk about our work. We don't get enough opportunities to talk anyway because we're both so busy. But to have the opportunity to talk has been a real joy.
It has. So I really appreciate you inviting me to kind of sit and have this conversation with you. So which means I'll be coming back at you again to pull you back in on the radio show soon.
I'm happy to do it. We had like a third part lined up once upon a time, and it never.
That's right.
Came, so I owe you one anyway.
That's right. And I think it's time to do it now, given the context of everything that's going on. So, So, Steve, let me just say this too. Just know that I really do appreciate the friendship. I appreciate the way that we've been able to work together as colleagues, and, have just great respect for your work as well. So thanks a lot.
You're very kind, and it goes both ways. It's been getting to know you over the last several years and working with you on some of these things. It's been a real pleasure.